All right. I do want to be respectful of everyone's time tonight, so we'll go ahead and get started. Like I said, if you guys could just let me know in the chat where you're at in your process, that'll definitely help our conversation this evening. So I'll go ahead and start off by introducing myself. My name is Krysta Foster. I use she, her pronouns. I work full time at a large university here in the Midwest and have been coaching on Leland for the last half of 2024, which has been really exciting. So in my time coaching, I've been working in higher ed for about the last decade or so. Previous to working sort of in that like pre-med space, I worked with student government, so doing a lot of student leadership training, campus programming, things like that. I've been coaching grad and medical school students for 4, coming up on 5 years officially in February, which is really exciting. Over that time, I've had the chance to work with hundreds of students who are looking at, again, either medical school, PA school, science PhD programs for the most part. But I really love working with pre-med students. It's always so fun for me to see all of the amazing things that y'all have accomplished and the things that you're really passionate about in terms of improving healthcare access. So I'm really excited to be here with y'all today. So this evening, we're going to be going through how you can select your programs that you'll be applying to. We're going to talk about the different components of the application. So really getting into the nitty-gritty of personal statements, activity sections, letters of recommendation, how we go about those processes. And so we're excited to just like highlight those for you. And then we'll also talk a little bit about the application timeline. So in terms of thinking through when you should be working on each piece of your application, we're going to talk about that extensively this evening. And then at the end of the presentation, I'll have a discount code for you if you're interested in purchasing some coaching so that we can start working together on your application package. As the name of the event suggests, winter break is a great time to start working on that personal statement, to start working on those activity sections, right? So that we can head into our next semester just feeling kind of set and ready to go, focusing on other things like our MCATs or our studies or whatever that needs to be. So I did see a couple of folks respond in the chat. So it looks like we've got a doctor here with us in the chat whose son is currently in high school. So really ahead of the curve. Thanks so much for joining us, Dr. Athma. And then we've got Kira here, a gap year pre-med student applying in this cycle, currently working as a medical assistant. So getting some really good experience for those applications, which is great. So thank you all for being here. So as promised, I first want to talk a little bit about how we select programs, right? Because I think especially when it comes to med school, we kind of get into the mindset that I'll just go anywhere that I'll get accepted, right? But it's really important to remember that as we're looking at programs, we want these to be places that you're excited about, right? You have worked too hard to not go to a program that's exciting to you. And so I'm not saying, don't be realistic, but I am saying that there are some things we want to take into consideration as we're choosing those schools. So a couple of quick guidelines. As you're looking at that school list, I want you to be trying to stay right around that 20 mark. 20 is the national average for students who are applying to medical schools. Certainly, if we can narrow that down to like 12 to 15, I would say that that's even better. But I know that with there being hundreds dozens of schools across the country, right, and hundreds across the world, if we're looking in other countries as well, I really want you to be thinking about like, where would I be most happy, right? Where are schools that really align with my values, which we'll talk about here in a second, but also like geographically, where do I want to be? Right. So taking into consideration, if you're from the East Coast, do you want to stay there? Right. Do you want to be close to your support systems, or are you interested maybe in, moving out to the Midwest or to the West Coast, moving down south, right? Like trying something new. So really just kind of being aware of like, what are your geographic considerations? We also want to look for that program alignment. So places that share the same values that we do, that really talk about having a vested interest and demonstrate a vested interest in the things that are important to us when we come to medicine. So the piece I want to circle back to real quick is this 20 schools piece. So I know that a lot of folks are, will say like, oh, I'm just going to apply to as many schools as I can and just hope that I get in. But the thing that I want you to think about, right, is that one, this process is really financially intensive. You're going to have an application fee at the beginning of the application, plus an additional fee for each of the schools that you send your app to. Then we're also going to have the secondary application process, which is, you guessed it, another round of fees, but also another round of essays, right? And so schools will have anywhere from, I would say, about 2 to 8 essays is typically what we see at average on the cycle. And so if you think, I'm going to apply to 30 schools and think that they have on average 4 or 5 questions each, that's another 120 to 150 essays you're writing. And certainly those are shorter than a personal statement. Some of them might have some overlap, but I really want us to make sure that we're managing your time and your financial resources really well by taking into consideration, like, where do you actually want to be? Right. So when we're thinking about that program alignment, we want to start thinking about program values. So if you've got a vested interest in working with marginalized populations and underserved communities, maybe you want to work in rural medicine, right? Really looking for programs that will offer you those opportunities, either as part of your clinical rotations, as part of your residency, that they've got faculty who are perhaps doing research in those spaces that you could partner with if research is a part of what you're looking for in your medical school journey. So looking for that values alignment from yourself and the program. We then want to, again, think about those research and clinical interests, taking into consideration what we're really excited about. If we've got a passion for reproductive health research, right? We want to look for programs that are going to offer us that opportunity to do research if that's something that we're interested in. On that note, right, thinking about the faculty that you want to connect with. This can also help when making decisions about whether we want to go MD, so those colleges of human medicine, so that allopathic program, right, which is typically what we think of when we think of traditional med school, versus osteopathic schools or that DO program that has a little bit more of that holistic mindset, right? Certainly physicians in every sense of the word, and they're really thinking about that connection between mind, body, and spirit. So thinking about, is this school that more focused on that MD or DO experience? How do they identify? What do their faculty look like? Things like that. So I want to go ahead and start getting into some of those application components. But as we do, I want us to first be thinking about some of the skills that we want to be displaying throughout our applications. So when I work with applicants, one of the first things that we do is sit down and really have a conversation about this list of competencies that you see up here on your screen. So this list of competencies is supplied by the AAMC, so the American Association of Medical Colleges. So this is the program or the organization rather that distributes the AMCAS application for MD programs. We've also seen the colleges of osteopathic medicine, so AACOM, adopt this list of competencies for their students as well. And so what I really love about this is that this gives us the chance to see what are schools looking for in their applicants, right? Essentially, this becomes sort of a job description. And so a really effective strategy that I use with the folks that I coach is that we build every piece of your application around these competencies, right? And so that doesn't mean that we're going to include all 17 or 18 or 19 of these skills into your personal statement, right? But maybe we're highlighting, 3 to 4 within your personal statement. And then we're making sure that they're well interspersed in your activity section. And then maybe we're making sure that each of your letter writers is touching on at least 2 or 3, right? So then by the time we put together this application, we've really crafted a story that demonstrates your competency in each of these areas, right? And there's no better way to really demonstrate to med schools that you're ready for this step than actually being able to demonstrate to them, here are the experiences I've had, here's how they've prepared me and given me the competencies that you are looking for in your incoming students, right? That's a very compelling argument for admission. So again, we want to make sure that we're really thinking about these competencies in the context of these types of experiences, right? So as we're thinking about our personal statements, our activity section, as we're thinking about the folks that we might engage with for our letters of recommendation, I want us to be reflecting on sort of these 5 types of experiences we might have had during our undergraduate career. For those of us who are still planning for undergrad, right? This is certainly a great list to come back to and sort of thinking about what are the types of opportunities I should be looking for? And then maybe for those of us who are in a master's program now, right, if we took the opportunity to earn a master's degree during our gap year, we want to reflect back on these experiences as we had them throughout our life, right? So first is those clinical experiences, things that count, for lack of a better phrase for this section, or is anything really where you're working with patients in that medical environment, right? This is can sometimes be shadowing physicians, but is more commonly going to be like our medical assistant roles, like Kira mentioned earlier. It's going to be roles where maybe we worked as a technician or a phlebotomist, right? Like within those clinics, within those hospitals. Volunteer work, anything about serving others, right? Really thinking about what is the impact that you want to make in the world, and what are the volunteer opportunities that you've pursued that have really helped you to demonstrate that. Taking into account our leadership, right? So thinking about RSOs or student organizations that you've been a part of. Maybe you've been a teaching assistant or an undergrad lab assistant, right? So really thinking about what are the skills that you developed in those capacities. Same thing with research, right? Being able to show that demonstration that you understand the scientific process, that you understand living systems. And then last but not least, oftentimes we see some sort of personal connection, especially in that personal statement, right? Which is are those pieces that have maybe like inspired us to go into medicine. So thinking of that personal statement, again, I want us to be keeping in mind sort of those competencies that we talked about, as well as the types of experiences. But I wanted to give us sort of just a high level overview of what we can expect from the personal statement throughout the medical school application process. So tonight's conversation is mostly going to focus around the AMCAS application, which is our application for MD schools here in the United States. And then we're going to talk about the ACOMAS application, which is for DO schools here in the United States as well. The exception to those programs in the US would be that Texas has its own system called the TEMDOS that they use for medical school, dental school, PA school. They just kind of have their own setup. And so certainly those are things we can talk about more in a coaching session. But for the purpose of kind of like streamlining tonight's conversation, we're going to focus on the AMCAS and the ACOMAS applications. So that personal statement prompt is quite simply, why do you want to be a physician, right? Which is a really broad question. And so we're going to talk about how we can get into that a little bit more specifically, focusing on developing our content around motivation, fit, and vision, right? And really going beyond that lens of, I like science and I want to help people, right? What I say to my students a lot is, if somebody is going into medicine, right, like we really hope that they like science and we really hope that they like people, right? That sort of feels like the baseline. And so we really want to make sure that in your personal statement, we're sharing how you've demonstrated those competencies in relation to your experiences in science, in relation to your experiences in medicine. For those essays for both the AMCAS and the ACOMAS, we're looking at a 5,300 character limit. As we're talking about this, one of the things that I often say to folks that I coach is that when you write those first couple drafts, right, don't get too attached to anything. Write as though there's not a word limit or character limit in the beginning, just to kind of get all of your ideas on paper. But we do want to make sure that we fall within that 5,300 character limit so that we're able to submit our essay successfully. So let's talk about the personal statement a little bit more. So I want to go into some logistics. And so the first piece is that, again, we want to make sure that we're answering that prompt, that why do you want to become a physician, right? And so the reason that I mentioned this really specifically and mentioned it multiple times is that sometimes when it comes to our personal statements, we see a lot of examples online where folks will just talk about a particularly difficult moment in their lives, usually related to medicine in some capacity, right? But we don't learn anything about them. We don't learn anything about their skill sets or their motivations. And so we really want to make sure that we're always coming back to that prompt. We want to make meaning of our experiences within that, right? So again, really going beyond, I like science and I want to help people, or just listing out the things that we've done. Again, we want to make sense of those stories, make meaning of those stories. And so if you're working as a medical assistant, for example, instead of just listing, I take vitals and I help out with insurance paperwork and, I help out with some like small procedures. Instead, I want you to think about like, what are some really impactful moments you've had as an MA, right? What are things that you observe from the physicians that you work with that demonstrate their values that you also want to embody in your work? Tell me a story maybe of a patient that you worked with where you really could tell that you made a difference, right? Maybe they came in really nervous and they're shaking. Maybe it's a kiddo, right, who comes in crying and doesn't want to get their shots. What was the way, how did you approach those things, right? How did you use your interpersonal and communication skills to connect with people, right? Or how did you use your understanding of human behavior, right, to be able to work with folks in a more conducive way? So again, really coming back to those competencies, making meaning of your experiences. When we're thinking about the paper, I also want you to make sure that you're getting multiple opinions, right? Having someone in your family read it to make sure that it sounds authentically like you, getting help from your university writing center, talking to a coach. But I also want to make sure that you're maintaining your voice, right? At the end of the day, your personal statement needs to still be personal to you. It needs to sound like you, which is why I really focus on making sure that I am offering guidance for students as they're writing their personal statements, while also helping them to tell the story in their own unique way. Another thing I want to take into consideration is that we could address any discrepancies from your undergraduate career or leading up to the application. So let's say maybe you had a semester that just like things did not go your way, right? Maybe you had some roommate trouble, maybe there's trouble back home. Maybe you're suffering from like some mental health issues, right? We've all been there. I think especially the last couple of years has taught us that, anything can happen and it can rock our game at any point. And so if your grades dropped for a semester, right, or you weren't able to participate in clubs or organizations, or like took a semester off from your MA or research position, we can talk about those in your application as well. And then last but not least, we want to make sure that we're writing well and proofreading, right? This personal statement is really the committee's first chance to see how well that we can communicate. So as we think about the flip side of this, right, the don'ts, I don't want us to be speaking in cliches or generalities, right? So moving away again from that, I like science and I want to help people, to something that's more foundational and more specific to your experience. I also don't want you to feel pressured to talk about traumatic events if you don't feel ready to talk about them, right? So a couple of examples of this might be, especially in med school personal statements, the one I see most commonly is that somebody has suffered their own personal like medical tragedy, right? Be that it happened to them, it happened to somebody that was really close to them. And those things can be really hard to talk about, right? Those can be really vulnerable. And while it's a great opportunity for you to tell a personal story about how you're connected to medicine, one, we want to keep it brief because it's not as related to your skill set, and that's what the committee most wants to know. But two, it can be really hard and traumatizing to talk about those things. And the thing that I always say when it comes to personal statements is if you wouldn't be ready to talk about it in an interview, I don't want you to talk about it in a personal statement, right? Anything that ends up on your application is going to be fair game for folks to ask you about during an interview process. And so I don't want you to feel like you would get put on the spot if, again, it's a tragic situation that you're just not quite ready to talk about. And then last but not least, we don't want to repeat information from your resume. So as I mentioned earlier, we want to tell stories as opposed to listing tasks. So when we think about our research position or our MA position, really leaning into what did we learn from those? What are stories we can share as opposed to just listing the tasks that we completed? So some things we might consider as we're putting together our personal statement would include our motivation, right? So what initially inspired you to pursue this path? This is oftentimes a very personal story. And so this is something we can use as an anecdote in your introduction. So just a real brief overview of, like what was the situation that you encountered, or was it a course, or was it a shadowing opportunity, or, was it something personal, right? We want to touch on that briefly and kind of talk about like where your inspiration comes from. And we really want to lean into how your motivation has grown and matured over time, right? So as you've had the chance to shadow, as you've had the chance to take on leadership roles or been a part of research or shadowed physicians, what are the things that you have learned that you really want to incorporate into your own practice? So speaking of that, we also want to start to think about your fit and your capacity for this work. So how do your skills and values align with the profession, right? What are the skills that you've developed? What are the values that you hold that will make you a really strong physician? And then what are the experiences that you've had that have helped to prepare you for this, right? Like where did those skills and values come from? And then last but not least, again, we want to be thinking about our vision. So how will you use those values and skills in your future work, right? What is the type of impact that you want to make? Taking into consideration, right, again, those topics that you're really passionate about, be that access to healthcare, or maybe it's working with refugee populations, maybe it's rural healthcare, right? There are any number of things that we could take into consideration when it comes to this, but I do want you to be sharing a little bit in your personal statement about that long-term vision and your goals and how that school is going to help you to get there. So I do want to do a quick review of essay basics because ultimately, again, the personal statement is a chance for us to turn in a writing sample that allows us, the committee, to really see what our communication skills are like. So a standard essay, just as a reminder, is going to have an introduction. This is usually where we include some sort of anecdote that, again, quickly talks about your experience, your initial exposure to the field. We're going to have those body paragraphs that are going to get into the specific experiences that have helped you to develop the skills you'll use as a physician. And then your conclusion, which is usually where we're going to talk a little bit about that future, that vision piece, and why you want to be a physician specifically, right? Why you want to take on that leadership role within healthcare as opposed to taking on a different type of role. So each of your paragraphs should have sort of like a similar theme, right, that we can use to tie into your skill set. So as we think about that introduction, so again, we want to share an anecdote or a story about how you became interested in science and medicine. And then we want to have your thesis. So what sort of major themes are you going to cover, right? Are we going to talk about your capacity for improvement, your ability to adapt, your interpersonal skills, right? We'll just kind of like name those competencies or those main themes that are coming up in that first thesis sentence. So then those body paragraphs are really meant to, again, highlight those competencies, those skills that you would be using in the profession. So I want you to introduce that skill or theme or competency. I want you to tell me a story about it, right? So again, when you're writing those first initial drafts, I want you just to write as though there is not a character limit, and really give me the ins and outs of the time you worked with a patient, or a time that you had to navigate a challenge in the research lab, or an opportunity you had to lead a student leadership team, but there was a significant amount of conflict, and so you had to figure out how to work through that, right? So again, telling those stories and then tying that back to how you would use that skill or embody that value within your practice of medicine, right? Always circling back to, this is who I am, and this is why I would make a great physician. So then we've got your conclusion, in which we want to reiterate your thesis statement, right? Again, just a review of those competencies that we touched on, and then moving into talking about your long-term vision and goals. So then let's go ahead and move into your activity section. I often like to have candidates write their activity section first because it can become really good fodder or really good brainstorming for our personal statements. But I know the personal statement is always the ones I get the most questions about, which is why I started there today. So in the activities section, again, we're going to focus on the AMCAS and the ACOMAS. We've got a little bit of a different setup in terms of our character limits. So for that AMCAS application, those MD schools, we're looking at a max of 15 entries, so 15 activities that you're able to list. You're going to be able to write about those in 700 characters for each of those 15 entries. So each entry gets 700 characters. You're then going to pick out of those 15 entries, 3 to be your most meaningful. And so for those 3 that you've selected as your most meaningful, you'll get an additional 1,325 characters. I don't know who picks these numbers, but I just wanted to give you all kind of the landscape of what we're working with here. So typically what we look at for those most meaningful sections is maybe where we can share a little bit more of a specific story of something that happened to us. This is a great way, right, to add more content to an experience that maybe we didn't get to talk about in our personal statement. So then moving over to the ACOMAS application, so our DO schools, you do get unlimited entries for that activity section. You can put in as many as you want, but you only get 600 characters to talk about each of them, and then you don't get a most meaningful section for this part. So I've got some strategies on how we can navigate those, right? So for the AMCAS, maybe we're grouping together several leadership positions you've had in the same student org, whereas for your ACOMAS, maybe we're splitting those out so we can talk about them in a little bit more detail. So as we're thinking about the content that we would use for these sections, typically what we're looking at are the tasks that we completed, the skills that we developed, and the application of those skills, right? So tell me a little bit about what you did, tell me about the skills that you've developed, and then tell me how you're going to use those in the work of medicine. So as we're thinking about those quick blurbs, I want you to talk about what you did, but I want you to be really brief about it, right? So for the most part, schools will know what a medical assistant typically does. They'll know what a research technician, a phlebotomist, a student organization president, right? They see enough of these applications every year that I don't need you to list out, I write the agenda, I lead the executive board, I manage the budget, I like complete all these tasks. What I do want you to really think about is what meaning did you take away from that experience, right? So briefly introduce them to like what the main tasks were that you completed, but then really dive into like what skills did you develop, what's unique about your perspective, right? Because they know what to expect from those roles in general, we really have an opportunity to talk about those roles from our personal lens, right? Which is what they're most interested in. And then we want to briefly talk about what we've learned from that situation and how we would apply it in the future. When we write those most meaningful sections for the AMCAS application, we want to tell a story and highlight a specific scenario, and then choose what's important to you. I often get the question from students about, well, which one should I pick as my most meaningful? What do the schools want to see as my most meaningful? And if we go with, highlighting the things that we think a program is most interested in, it's not going to come across as being your most meaningful experience, right? You could have, an MA role and a research tech role and a student org role and a hospice volunteering role. And maybe your hospice volunteering is one of the most meaningful, right? Maybe that situation really touched you, really gave you an affinity for working with folks who are in that final stage of life. And that's like a story that you really want to tell. That's what we want to lean into, even if it's not as, sexy or robust as some of your other roles, for lack of a better phrase, right? We want to make sure that we're really leaning into what was most meaningful to you. So then as we think about the don'ts, again, we don't want to go into too much detail about those tasks. Schools are going to know what to expect from an MA role or science research tech role. We don't want to include experiences that aren't truly impactful, right? So if you volunteered for your school service day one time during your sophomore year and you never went back and volunteered again with that organization, we don't need to include that, right? Altruism is great. Volunteering work is important in your application, but I want it to be from the standpoint of volunteer work that you did was really meaningful, right? I don't want it to be like that thing you did one time and don't really have anything to talk about. And then last but not least, again, don't undersell yourself, right? So really thinking about what are these different experiences that we've had, right? Don't undersell those class research experiences you've had, or that poster that you got to present with your team, or again, those volunteer opportunities where you did go back a significant amount of time, right? If it was something that you did once a week or once a month or a couple times a year, where maybe you're like tutoring kiddos at the elementary school, right? And you're like, well, that was just fun for me. No, that's still an important skill set. And we want to talk about that within the context of your application. So again, just kind of a quick review of the logistics. So that activity section, we're going to talk about what did you do? So again, those tasks you completed, what skills you developed, what you learned and how you developed those skills, and then how you'll use that in the future. So again, the bulk of that section really should be the skills that you developed and really leaning into that meaning-making experience. So then let's talk about your letters of recommendation. So those letter writers can come from a variety of places, but first and foremost, we want to make sure that we have somebody who's a science faculty member. So this needs to be somebody who has observed you in a classroom environment as part of your studies, either in undergrad or in a master's program. It needs to be one of your, what we would consider the hard sciences. So physics, chemistry, biology, orgo, physio, all of those types of classes, right? Somebody who can really speak to your academic aptitude within the context of science, right? Med school is hard. And so they really want to hear from somebody who can speak to your academic aptitude. So a question I get from a lot of folks is, what if I TA'd for a professor, right? Does that count as a science faculty member? And what I would say is, if you had them in class as well, right? If you were a student in their class, you could ask them to dedicate part of the letter to your TA experience, but that they should also write significantly about their experience with you as a student. Ideally, we would use that letter for the professor that you've TA'd with to be like your supervisor letter, to talk a little bit more about your skills in helping others to learn, right? And in your ability to teach complex subjects, which we know is a really important skill in medicine. But again, that science faculty member should be somebody who has observed you as a student in their classroom. It's great to have a letter from a physician, specifically if we're applying to DO programs. They want to see a letter from a DO, right? That's something I hear from osteopathic schools over and over again, is how important it is for them to know that you have really invested time in understanding osteopathic medicine, that you understand what it means, right, to be sort of part of that holistic care team. So again, would love to have a letter from a physician. This can be someone you shadowed or somebody that you worked with. I would try to align it with the application that you're using, right? Certainly you can be applying to both MD and DO programs. And then I'd suggest that you have a letter from both. We also want to have a letter from potential supervisors, right? People who have supervised us in a student job or who have been a volunteer manager that we've worked with as part of some of our volunteer work. And then we can also look to our advisors, right? If there's an academic advisor that you worked with really routinely throughout your time in college, that's a great person to ask for a letter of rec as well. And so your letter writers don't have to touch all of these areas, but we always do want to make sure we have a science faculty member, and then the rest of them should be folks who kind of help to round out our experience, right, and demonstrate those competencies. So then let's get into the logistics. I see we've got a question in the chat about it already. So I say up to 7 letters because that's typically the max that schools will have. And so the cool thing about the systems though, right, is that you can kind of decide which letters you submit to which programs. And so if you have 10 collected in, let's say like your Interfolio account, you can sort of select, right, like which letters you're going to send to which program. And so again, if you've already got them collected, I think that's great. 10 is an amazing number that you've got that many folks who are willing to like speak to your aptitude in those different areas. But again, we really want to make sure that you have at least solidly 3. And ideally up to 5. So schools will set a limit on how many you can actually upload per institution. So the highest max I've ever seen is 7. So again, if you have 10, you're going to kind of have to pick and choose which ones you're going to send. But typically schools will say about 3 to 5. I always recommend trying not to go over 5 just because after that, right, like maybe schools aren't looking at them as deeply. And so if we have 3 to 5 really, really strong letters, right, making sure that we're uploading them and submitting the things that we know are really relevant to our skill set and really representative of the work that we're capable of. So it's totally fine to have 10, but just think about how you might use them strategically across the different programs that you're applying to. And again, that content that your letter writer should be touching on is your ability to perform in those different competency areas, right? So if you're getting a letter from a physician, really having them touch on your ability to succeed in the medical environment, right? How have they seen demonstrated commitment to patient care and to understand living systems?
And then she don't want to change.
Does somebody have a question, or maybe we just got somebody who's unmuted right now?
I'm not gonna change. She don't want to change. She still has all these negative thoughts. She still is gonna hate his wife. That's why.
Okay. Awesome. Okay, yeah, Josh. Maybe 8 to 10, but being combined with the committee letter, and the committee letter requires certain letters. Okay. Yeah, that's always something that we can chat a little bit about too, if you're interested. All right. So maybe I'll take a quick pause here. I know we've talked about a lot, right? We talked about personal statements. We talked about the activity section. We talked about those letters of recommendation. Before we get into the application timeline, are there other questions that folks have right now? So there's a question in the chat about what about a PA I shadowed in a kidney clinic? Since I'm deciding between hospital volunteer supervisor and the PA, who is someone I know and has been taking care of my family, what I'm also thinking of already asking is an OBGYN I shadowed a few times back in September, October. Yeah, so I would say a PA is a great option, right? Somebody who has observed your work in the medical environment. So again, if you've worked with them in your capacity as a hospital volunteer and they can really speak to your aptitude in that space, I think that that's great. And then the volunteer supervisor, I think I would again come back to who do you feel like can touch on competencies that maybe other folks won't be able to touch on, right? So the OBGYN that you shadowed, that OBGYN, right, can probably talk about your ability to work in that medical care environment. So then instead, maybe we look at the volunteer supervisor because they can talk about, right, like your commitment to helping others, right, or maybe some of your organizational or leadership skills. But if you feel like the PA can also do that, then I think that that's a good option too. The great thing about this, and maybe the worst thing about this, is that there's no right or wrong answer. You said for context, I have 3 currently for my professors, and your university only allows 5 in a letter packet. Okay, yeah. So yeah, I think the OBGYN, obviously, because we'd love to have one from a physician. And again, when you're deciding between the PA and the hospital supervisor, I would reflect on those competencies, think about what skills you would want them to highlight that you haven't been able to highlight in your application packet yet. Awesome. Any other questions about the components of the application? those personal statements, activity sections, things like that. All right, someone said, I might have missed this discussed earlier, but how can you ask letter writers to include information about the competencies in the letter? Oh, this is such a great question, Daphne. So as somebody who writes a lot of letters, I love when students tell me what they want me to write about, right? We're often working with them in so many different capacities on so many different projects that we really want to make sure that we're able to provide our letter writers with some structure on what we're hoping that they can touch on, right? So after you've confirmed that somebody will write a letter for you, typically the way I suggest phrasing it is sending a follow-up email saying, thank you so much for agreeing to write this letter for me. I really appreciate it. During our time together, something that I think I've really appreciated or a skill set that I think I've really been able to develop is, right, and then segueing into if that's interpersonal skills or an understanding of the scientific process, and then sort of demonstrating or highlighting a little bit, I think I did this through our research work leading up to publication or to our poster presentation, or, I think I really developed my interpersonal skills while working with patients with you here in the clinic, and talk about it a little bit. And then you can always sort of end the email by saying, I'll of course defer to your professional expertise. But, again, this is a skill set I feel like I really developed with you. And so I would really appreciate if you could write about it. So again, just thanking them for writing the letter overall, introducing those competencies and highlighting a couple of ways that you feel like you've developed that competency with them, and then ultimately saying that you will defer to their professional expertise and opinion, but that you would really appreciate them highlighting those competencies within the context of your application. Awesome. Hopefully that's helpful. Josh, yes, I do offer coaching here on Leland. So when we get to the end of the presentation, I'll have my profile link for you and actually a discount code that you can use for 25% off your first hourly order as we're getting set up for the application process here. Awesome. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into timeline. So I included the full timeline because I really wanted to remind you all that this is a marathon, not a sprint, right? Applying to medical school, again, as we've talked about, is a really financially intensive process. It's a really time-intensive process, right? This essentially ends up extending almost 2 years from the time that you start studying for your MCAT to the time that you'll actually matriculate to a med school program, right? So many of you are probably in this phase right here, right? Kind of where we're at in the timeline is this like fall to spring progression, where hopefully, right, like we're either prepping for the MCAT or maybe we've already taken it for the first time. You're here, so we're starting to think about personal statements and activity sections, which is great. Those primary applications, as you know, are going to open in May, or if you don't know, what we typically see is with the AMCAS and the ACOMAS application, those are going to open in the first week of May. And with the AMCAS application, you'll be able to submit starting at the end of May. The ACOMAS application, you should be able to start submitting right away. What a lot of folks don't know is that it's actually okay for you to submit anytime from that May date through December. While I wouldn't recommend waiting until December, what I would say is don't put too much pressure on yourself to apply at that first drop in May, right? First of all, the systems are going to take some time to really process the applications, to go through and verify everything. So that first batch isn't even going to go out to programs until end of June or early July at the very earliest is what we've been seeing. I honestly, ideally, as long as you're in by Labor Day, so that first weekend in September, we're in good shape. Right? I would just keep in mind, right? If you apply a little bit later in the cycle, it just means that the rest of your application process is going to run a little bit later than everybody else, right? So your application is going to look different than somebody who applied in May because that's just how time works, right? If they submitted in May, right, they might be hearing about interviews in August and September. If you apply in July or August, we might be hearing about interviews more in November, December, January, right? And that's okay. Med schools are looking for the best applicants. They're not looking for the people who just submit first, right? And so while we can certainly work on an aggressive timeline, especially if we're working on things over winter break and really getting yourself set up for success, I don't want you to feel despondent or you're completely out of the process if you haven't applied in May or June. Again, secondary applications are going to start typically in July is when we see those start to be released after schools have gotten that first round of applications from the application systems. We want to get those back within 2 weeks for each of the schools. Again, this is all stuff that we can talk about a little bit more later on down the road. Interviews will start as early as August, but they will run through March of that following year, right? So all the way into March of 2026. So again, if you're not hearing about interviews right away in August, that's okay. Wait that time. Schools are looking for commitments around April of 2026. That's when we'll start to see some movement on those wait lists. And then med school will begin in that summer of 2026. A lot of classes will either start in that June, July, August, sometimes September timeline. I did see a quick question. Someone mentioned, I have a question since I'm not from the US. I'd like to know, can you talk about the med school application in Texas if it's similar? I live in Texas and would like to know if it's the same as the AMCAS. It's very similar. Their system differs in that they use it for a number of different health professions. So I think their character counts are pretty similar to the AMCAS application. If I'm not mistaken, it's around that like 5,000 character limit. They're going to have the activity section, but for sure, that's something that I could always like send you some more information about if you want to ping me after the workshop. So I know that we did sort of like a brief overview of the timeline, but I really want to focus on just that timeline that's really going to get you through that first primary submission, right? Because as of this point, right, that's all that we can control, right? We can't control if you're going to get secondary applications. We can't control when you're going to get your interviews. And so I really just want to focus on what does that timeline look like for these main areas, right? For our activity section, for personal statements, our primary apps. So we're going to talk about what the next couple of months will look like as you're getting ready to submit these materials. So in December through February, I really want you to start gathering your list of programs and the schools that you're most interested in, right? It's totally okay for you to contact them, right? To ask to talk to a current student who goes there, right? For you to ask for a little bit more information about the program and things that are important to them. So this is, again, a great time to start figuring out how can we get that list to around 20-ish schools, if not a little bit less, and finding those programs that are really aligned with your values. Your letters of rec, if you haven't already started to secure those, I would definitely recommend reaching out to those folks here in the next month or two, especially those faculty members right before things start getting really crazy in the semester in the spring, reaching out to them soon after winter break, just to kind of secure those letters and then start to send those follow-up emails, really putting some thought into those competencies you'd like for them to highlight. And then again, this December through February timeline is great for starting to put together your first outlines and drafts of your activity sections. So again, this is something that I offer a lot of coaching for here on Leland, have a lot of experience with. I worked with a couple hundred applicants over the last 5 years. And so happy to sit down and talk about this more. But again, this is a great time to just start doing some of those brainstorming so that we can really start to get a grasp on what we might want to talk about in your personal statement versus what we'll kind of save to go more in depth on in your activity section. So then as we get to March and April, I really want you to be narrowing down that program list, right? So if you started with a list of like 30 or 40 or even 50 schools, we want to try to start narrowing that down, right? Getting really serious about where do you actually want to live, right? If you hate the cold, Michigan is not the place for you. If you really don't want to be hot all the time, right? Florida is probably not a great fit. If you want to stay close to your family and you live in California, right? Like we're not heading out to the East Coast. So again, really thinking about geographically, where do you want to be? Where's your support system? Are you ready for a big adventure? Would you rather stay close to home and your family and friends, right? Those are all valid opinions. And I just want you to think about what's important to you. For your letters of rec in this timeline, this is typically when we're asking them to start thinking about like locking in and actually starting to write those letters. So sending over a copy of your updated resume, a draft of your personal statement so they can see what you've touched on so far. And then that specific guidance, right? Just kind of reiterating and reminding them like, hey, these are the competencies I'm really hoping that you can hit on. You might find that some of your letter writers also ask you to like fill out a worksheet or a form to kind of give them a better idea of what opportunities you want them to talk about or experiences you want them to talk about. So just be ready to send all of that to them, I would say typically in March and April. And then on your statements, where we're in activity sections, that's when we're really starting to make edits, starting to refine things so that we can get those locked in for the final. And so then in May through June, but again, this can extend until to July or August or even that first weekend in September. we want to make sure that we're starting to put the final touches on your application as we get ready to submit. So your letters of recommendation, we can send reminders as needed, right? Those can go through Interfolio. They can go through the platform. They can be just emails or phone calls that you make to your letter writers. And then your statements and activity sections. This is, again, when we're finalizing everything and then going ahead and submitting. Just a reminder that, again, I want you to apply when you're your best applicant, right? So if you think that you could do a little bit more work on your personal statement because it's not quite as tight or as specific as you want it to be, but you're like, oh my God, it's the end of May, I just need to hit the submit button. No, like, let's take the extra week. Let's take an extra 2 weeks to go through it, to really refine it, right? Ideally, you're going to do this once. We're going to apply to med school once, hopefully, right? Again, it's expensive, it is time intensive, and I want you to put together an application that you're really proud of the very first time, right? And so if that means delaying your process by a week or two, I promise you that that is infinitely worth it. I've worked with students who hit submit as soon as the AMCAS application lets them in May, and they haven't gotten in because they rushed their application, they didn't make meaning of their experiences, right? They didn't take the time to really commit to the application process. Meanwhile, I've had students who have submitted at the end of August, got their final MCAT scores in September, and got into 5 MD programs here in the United States and had their pick of schools and scholarships. So again, I just really want you to be thinking about just how important it is to take the time to refine your application. Question from Josh in the chat. If you're concerned about getting interviews and acceptances, even if you have schools you really want to attend, should an applicant consider a wider or larger school list, so greater than 20? So again, what I'll say is, because this process is so expensive, that's something I want you to keep in mind, right? You're going to have that initial application fee of, I want to say it's like $175 for each of the portals, right? So $175 for AMCAS. I think it's about the same for ACOMAS. And then you've got like another $46 per school that you're paying to submit your stuff to. Then you've got your secondary fees that are going to come into play, which can be anywhere from $50 to $200. We also have additional essays you need to write for your secondaries. And so what I don't want to see happen is that you apply to, I think there's between AMCAS and ACOMAS, 76-ish med schools across the US. I had an applicant whose family was like, we just want you to apply and get in, and we're willing to foot the bill no matter what it was. Well, she applied to all 76 schools here in the United States. It like come secondary season, it was really rough. She wrote over 200 essays over the course of a couple months, right? And so I always joke, like, you don't want to be Alexander Hamilton, right? Nobody wants to spend their entire essay or their entire summer writing essays. So really think about, Josh, if you're going to go larger than 20, why you're doing that, right? Like if there are schools that you're genuinely interested in, but maybe instead what we consider is like within your 20 that we're including like a couple of reach schools, right? Where like your MCAT is right on the bubble of what they would consider their average or mean. Then maybe we're looking at some schools where you're pretty solidly in that range in terms of what they're looking for in their students. And then maybe we have a few, right, where you're like, okay, yeah, like my MCAT, my GPA, my experiences really seem to like supersede what a lot of the students like bring into the program here. So I feel really confident in this application. So I would say we would instead look to be within that 20, 25 if we have to, and really just making sure that we've got a wide spread of schools in there. Question from TP. Have you worked with non-traditional students with a corporate background? I have worked with non-traditional students in students who have taken a couple of gap years. Honestly, most of the students I work with come from a science background, but certainly, again, I know that really building the application around the competencies is something that schools are really focused on now. So as long as we can work together to really build an application for you that highlights your skill set in relation to those competencies, no matter where you gained those skills, I feel confident that's something that we could definitely work on together. All right. Glad to hear that it's helpful, Josh. Another question here. Any suggestions on universities accepting BS and D programs and any key success criteria? So I think what you're asking is about some of those like direct admits, right? Where like they come in and do a bachelor's degree and then they have sort of that pathway to an MD program. Correct me if I'm okay. Perfect. So I think what they're really looking for, in my experience in talking to the contacts at the med schools at the university that I work at. So we have two med schools on our campus. One is a College of Osteopathic Medicine, the other is a College of Human Medicine. And so for programs like that, I think what I have heard the med schools struggle with the most is finding students who are mature enough at 18, 19, 20 that they feel really confident in saying, like, this person could absolutely be a doctor in the next 4 years, right? That's a tough sell. I don't know about y'all, but at 18, 19, 20, I don't think I was demonstrating the type of maturity that somebody would need to demonstrate to be a physician, right? Certainly I could be a professional and I could conduct myself in a meeting and I was, professional and in class. But it's hard to say at 18, 19, 20, right? What maturity looks like to be able to project into the future, right? 4 or 5 years that this person will be ready to become a physician. So I think anything that you can do to really show that you are ready for that type of challenge, that you've been significantly exposed to the environment, again, leaning into those competencies. The other thing that I might have you consider is that there are schools that will offer, they're not like direct pathway programs, or rather not direct admit programs, they're more like pathway programs. So what'll happen typically is that students will apply to this like scholars program within the med school as they're coming into a bachelor's degree. Throughout their undergraduate, they'll have a number of requirements that they have to meet, like going and shadowing with specific types of physicians, being a part of clubs and organizations, doing volunteer work, coming in and shadowing or like doing informational interviews with some of the current med students. And then as they're getting ready to matriculate to med school, they can typically apply on an accelerated timeline, and then they'll sometimes receive an MCAT waiver depending on the program. So there are lots of schools like that. I would, again, look for pathway programs that can, again, offer really strong opportunities for students who are excited about like pursuing that route really specifically once they get to school. Those direct admits, again, I think it's just tough because it's hard to say maturity wise, right? If somebody will be ready in 4 or 5 years. So I think you had said that your son would be applying to schools. And so if you can encourage him to look at some of those pathway programs, I think that would be a great fit. Awesome. Great. Well, a couple of final bits of advice, and then I'll stick around for questions here. But first, I want to recommend that you limit your time on reading other people's personal statements. I often hear from folks, well, I read on the internet or I saw on Reddit, right, this person's statement, and I don't have anything that would help my statement to sound like that. That's okay. Your personal statement is supposed to be personal to you. And so I really want to make sure that, yes, like we can get samples and we can look at like what structure works and what really resonates with us. But I don't want you to get so locked into like there's only one right answer for a personal statement, because there's not. On that same note, I would encourage you that if you're starting your application process, stay off of Reddit. Reddit is a great forum for a lot of funny content. It's a great forum for gaining like basic information about timelines and things like that, which you now have because we talked about those this evening. What it's not a great place for is hearing from folks on whether or not they already heard about interviews from a specific school, right? Or if they already received their secondary applications. There's a lot of bad information on the internet. Again, I work with colleagues across the state here in Michigan, but especially on my campus who work at med schools in the admissions office. And they're like, you would not believe how many times a year I get on Reddit and see in October that people are telling students on Reddit that we're not taking interviews anymore when we're in fact still interviewing up through like January, February, March. So again, if you are on the message boards, please try to limit your time there. Ask a coach instead. Don't believe everything you read, right? I just really find that candidates who are able to stay away from Reddit often feel a lot more like solid and secure in their application process. They feel a lot more confident. Don't overthink your first draft on your personal statement, right? So it doesn't have to be pretty. I just need you to get your ideas out. So especially if we're working together on that statement, I want you to just get your ideas out there in a way that, again, allows me to see your experiences, allows me to see what you've gained from them. I can work with you to streamline them and to make them more concise. What I can't do, right, is to speak to your experience from your lens. You're the only person who can do that. Give yourself lots of time, right? Which is why I wanted to do this workshop right before winter break over the holidays. And hopefully everyone's got a little bit of time off from school or from work to, maybe sit down. And of course, we want to rest and relax and recharge. But I don't know about y'all, but after about a week, I get a little antsy and it's nice to have a project to focus on. So this is a great way to channel that. Maintain your voice throughout the process. Make sure your personal statement sounds like you and highlight your unique point of view. So as promised, I've put, the QR code so that you can set up a free intro call with me and we can talk a little bit more about your specific needs with the application process. I've also got a code here that you can use for 25% off your first hourly coaching order with me. That's good here for the next couple of months. So I'll go ahead and leave that up here on the screen as we're doing just like final thoughts and questions. So any other questions y'all still have for me, feel free to unmute or go ahead and pop those in the chat. Yeah, it looks like we've got a hand raised. Ali, you want to go ahead and unmute? Oh, shoot. If you're talking, I can't hear you. Oh, okay. Do you want to go ahead and pop it in the chat maybe? Any questions from anyone else while Ali is getting their thoughts down in the chat? Yeah, you're so welcome. Should we prioritize letters of rec from science professors in a post-bac or master's compared to undergrad? It's a great question. So I would say whoever can speak to your skill set and competency as it exists now. So again, if you have been in a post-bac, if you've been in a master's program and you've been in like a hard science class, right? Again, that's sort of the most important piece. To really make sure that they can talk about your capacity to perform in a science classroom. I would say that it could be from undergrad or from your post-bac or master's. Just think about the faculty that you have the best relationship with, who can speak to your capacity in a scientific classroom. So I hope that that's helpful. Okay, Ali said, I came late, apologies. I saw the last few slides of May. Could I see the January through April slides quickly to screenshot? Yes. I think too that Leland recorded this, so we can also get you a copy of the recording. You know what? I can probably also give you all, let's do this. I'm going to share a public view link to the presentation so that y'all are able to access that. And so, yeah, you can at least take a look at this as we're getting the recording ready too. So this would be all of the slides. If you want to go ahead and click on that link, it should be a public view link so that you're able to view it all. Awesome. Well, I'll go ahead and stick around here for just a minute or two if folks still have questions. But officially, that is the end of the presentation. Please feel free to reach out to me on Leland, set up that free intro call so we can talk a little bit more about your application specifically. And be sure to use that discount code if you want to go ahead and chat a little bit more. So you're all so welcome. Thanks so much for spending your evening with me. Have a great rest of your week. Looks like another question. I was wondering how to go about editing my personal statement draft I did earlier in the year. I was going to apply this cycle, but had to postpone for the next. Yeah, so we just want to make sure that this is reflective of the applicant that you are right now. So really making sure that if there are significant experiences that you've had during your gap year, right, maybe you took on a job, maybe you've been researching, that we go back and incorporate those to make sure that it's updated, just as updated as possible. So I hope that's helpful. Let's see, next question. I'm kind of on May 3rd. Do you think that will negatively impact me? Absolutely not. That's honestly so early. Your scores will be in by early June. If anything, yeah, I mean, you can still get in with that first application cycle. If we get your personal statement, your activity section in before that, then we'll just wait to see what your MCAT scores are, right? Because might help to determine like where we submit our applications. But yeah, then we could still do that in early June. And I think that actually puts us in a really good shape in terms of the application timeline. So May 3rd, not a problem at all. What would you say to someone who struggles with confidence in their experiences? Come work with me. I promise. One of my favorite things to do is to help y'all remember just how impressive you are, right? And how much work you've put into these experiences. I would say just start by honestly, like listing out all of the things that you've done and then sit down with a friend or a family member who knows you really well and ask them what's missing, right? Ask them to like, sort of give you the chance to talk about each of those experiences, right? Make sure that it's somebody that'll really push you. Again, I'm happy to do that with you as well. But I would say just start by listing everything that you've done, write about it in as much detail as you can, have somebody who will really push you in talking about the details. I would say that's one of my favorite parts of the application process is helping folks to really see like all of the things that they've achieved through their activities. You work too hard to be super humble about it, Kira. Don't forget that. Let's see. How would admission people think about being a personal care assistant for a family member? The only other experience I had clinically is volunteering and shadowing. Yeah, I think it'll mostly just be in how we talk about it, right? And the skill set that you bring to that, really sort of highlighting, right, like what your specific role was in caring for that family member. I think there's definitely ways for us to talk about it, especially if we're able to highlight the other competencies, right? Your ability to work in a scientific environment, right? If you've been a part of research work and things like that. So I do think like we can still put together a competitive application that way. The other thing, right, is that sometimes caring for a family member ends up needing to be our top priority, right? And so that's a valuable experience to talk about as well. Not everybody's going to have that same traditional route, right, where they had the chance to work in a clinical setting. So my science GPA is 3.3 and overall is 3.6. Do you think I should target DO schools and a few less selective MDs? So it's hard to say without all of the information. Anecdotally, I would say that yes, that'll probably be our strategy. Ultimately, this all kind of depends on what you want out of your med school experience, right? If you decide that you really want to go into an MD program, maybe we talk strategies for applying to a master's or a postbac and really boosting that GPA and getting you some more research experience so that you can pursue those MD programs that you're excited about. But if you're like, nope, I just want to go to med school, and honestly, I'm really excited about that holistic approach that DO schools take, we can do that too. So yeah, Ali would love to chat with you more about it. It's always hard in these sessions, right? Just meeting y'all off the bat to like give really strong answers for things like that. But again, anecdotally, I would say that yes, that's probably the strategy we would go with. And then we could also talk about what it looks like to do a master's or postbac program. Okay, another question. I am from Sub-Sahara, South Africa. Okay, so from Africa, I want to enroll with full sponsorship around the globe. Yeah, you too, Ali. Yeah, I would say again, this is something that I would love to chat with you about more on one, even if that's in like a free intro call. You can book those on my Leland page. Again, that's something that we'll want to take a look at to see how different schools work with international students to provide that support. So absolutely something that we can talk about in more detail for sure, for sure. Awesome. Well, again, thank you all so much for being here. I will send out some follow-up messages with a link to my page and with the recording once we have that. So I hope you have a great rest of your week. We'll talk to you soon.